Hola, chicas y compañeros. I'm Dr. Stone Meredith, Dr. M, to my students at Colorado State University Global Campus who are enrolled in the courses for the dual enrollment certificate program. And again, the great thing about that program is that folks can get through that program and be certified to teach high school students to receive dual enrollment credit for college classes. And so always want to point out that there are some differences in working with a younger population than, say, working in a college classroom where maybe a college faculty is working with someone who is an adult, or maybe even diverse populations where people are multiple ages, right? So maybe you have somebody who's 18 alongside somebody who's 60 and 30 and 40. So that creates a different dynamic. So I think it's really important to remember, especially when you're working on the teaching of composition, that the power dynamics are a little bit different when there is one adult and a group of kids, most of whom are not 18 and who are in really a different place with brain development. And also, I think it's important to remember that they're in a different place with experience. So when you work in a composition classroom with people who are diverse age groups, which has been the majority of my experience, you have these opportunities to leverage people who have on the job experience. Maybe they're currently working in a profession they've been in a while. And so they have the ability to talk and write in multiple places in their lives. Maybe they are writing work emails, maybe they're writing in other ways. And so it's kind of nice when you're talking about teaching writing and teaching composition to be able to say, okay, let's look at how academic writing is different from how you do it on your job. Do you have to write emails? Do you have to send out memos? All those kinds of things. And so you can open those conversations about the connections between academic writing and the connections between professional and work writing. But I think when you're working with younger populations, those connections are there as well, because when we read and write, the ideas and the connections are really the same, right? Why does one communicate? Because we want one person has an idea to convey to another. And so while there are a lot of trappings around academic writing, right? One must cite, be it MLA or APA format at CSU Global, and in the social sciences and all the STEM fields, it's likely going to be APA. In English studies and a few of the humanities, still, it's going to be MLA format where the text is more alive. So you have all those trappings around citation that become so easy to measure in a rubric and so easy for students to focus on getting right, and for teachers, if we're not careful, to maybe focus too heavily on getting right. But the basic premise of communication is the same, which is why the conversations we have early in our first course about the reader, writer, text, and the rhetorical triangle are so important. And I think also that rhetorical triangle is something we want to return to, this idea of ethos, logos, and pathos, and considering what are the three rhetorical appeals. We appeal to one's emotion or pathos. We appeal to a sense of ethics, either shared or one that we're counter to. And then the whole reason, of course, is to get to that logos, that logic that we share. So a lot of tools covered in this 501 course and in the field of rhetoric and composition. But one thing I think that American education in the field of scholarship has done very well from World War II forward, when we really saw this influx after World War II, and this idea that through the GI Bill, anyone who had served their country and had a desire to get a college education could return to school. We see this real flourishing in the American education system, that one must create resources to make sure that everybody has access to literacy. And I would argue that over the past, 80 plus years, really, but close to 80 years, America as a culture has worked very diligently to create access to resources and handouts and tools to help writers grow in what we call a writing process. That term really takes hold heavily in 1970s, or maybe even a post process in the 80s and 90s. You hear those terms. I'll argue that whether you call it a writing process or a writing post process, at this point in the game, in the 2020s, and forward, it all kind of has come to mean one thing, mean a similar thing. And this idea that we teach students not to just sit down and write, but that it must be broken down into steps and stages that can be learned, right? So it's not the muse must sit down and some people can write and some people can't. Um, from over the last century, I think American education has done a very good job in showing that is not the case, that folks can be taught to write in any genre. In the case of rhetoric and composition and academic writing, it's a very specific format. And there are a lot of terms that people use for what that cadence of what a paragraph must look like. For me, I talk about the meal plan, main idea, cited evidence, analysis, and then maybe a link to the next idea. And multiple writing centers have excellent materials out there to help you leverage that idea. Duke University has a great one. They have multiple examples of it. But if you just type in meal plan, paragraph planning, you'll find them at Duke. You'll also find them at for-profit schools like Capella University. The one I wrote for them is probably even still up there. Who knows if that iteration is still there. But all types of facilities and types of learning institutions use different shortcuts. Call it the meal plan, call it whatever the case may be, where we try to create these tools where we give writers this idea that there are steps in a process, and you can learn little tricks and little formulas to help you build various steps in the process. A major part of the writing process that has really taken hold from the 1970s forward in American education is this idea that we move from global concerns to local concerns. And so, as teachers, I think it's really important to think about that. The theory and some of the major thinkers behind these ideas proffer ideas like, why would you get the commas perfectly if you may just revise them and edit that sentence out, right? And the concern becomes if we rush students too quickly to getting grammar in place, then of course they're much more hesitant to change organization and to revise it because that always looks perfect, right? And in a culture that, bless its heart, is doing its best to teach students how to read rubrics and get all the points and do their best and win, a byproduct of that can be that students can too quickly rush to the rubric and miss the opportunity to really learn to value their ideas and learn to appreciate the agency they have in making choices, which is another reason that thinking about teaching students this process, one that iterates from global to local, is so important. And I keep saying iterate. What do I mean by that? So let's imagine that we break it down from the beginning and we say, okay, we're gonna talk about dogs. And so in the beginning, let's write down everything we know about dogs. So let's do some pre-writing and get down some ideas on paper that we know about dogs and everything. What are our biases? Do we like dogs? Do we prefer cats? What do we know about dogs? Have we ever had one? Again, looping back to that idea that I use with my adult learners. What do you already know and how do you already write? It's that same idea in pre-writing, no matter the topic. Get down on paper what you already know. And for academic writing, it's really important to ask writers to get out their bias as well. What do you privilege? What do you like? What do you dislike? And then another key piece can be saying, what do you not know? What would you like to learn more about? Because it's certainly easy enough to do in our digital age, right? So this idea of the pre-writing process is really important because it allows students to kind of get started. And many in our field argue that the writing process begins as soon as you hear the prompt, and I'm among them. And I'd like to cite Dr. Marcia Lee Baker, who was my mentor and instructor at Western Carolina University, for really showing me the power in that idea. And do feel free to Google her for any materials, even if you just want to get behind her work for Rhetoricians for Peace and her other strategies for nonviolent activism in the community. But again, this idea that you pre-write, and so you begin to see where you really stand before you make that move to start to answer the question. We can teach students all kind of strategies for breaking apart the question. What's the verb? What's the subject? Is it a compare contrast? Is it all those kinds of things? But once you make that move to the actual act of completing the product, the process is pretty far down the road. And the concern for many of the scholars we read in our courses, and for many of the scholars who continue to proffer in the field, is this idea that if you don't take that pause for that moment of critical thinking and awareness of where the writer is in his or her own world, then we miss a lot of opportunities. So, as we talk about writing as process and some of the things the American education system does so well, remember that in our goal to measure our students and get winners out front and show people where to grow, that time is the enemy. And it is so easy to move them through the stages of the writing process without remembering that early phase of identifying who they are. What do you know? What do you want to know? And then from that step, you can move through the steps of the writing process. Global concerns, focus, development, organization. Get a thesis in place. Then work about developing those paragraphs that will support that thesis. Maybe you use the meal plan. Maybe you teach them another way to think about ways to make a main idea evidence and then analyze that evidence, whatever you may call it in the district, how you work. But again, if you give them that opportunity to be an expert, this is what I know and this is what I think about the topic, you set that foreground for agency before you ever begin the task. And so they have made some choices. They are the expert on what they know, so that when they begin to go in and make a thesis statement and to try to organize their ideas, there's some authentic thought that's happened there, and they truly are the expert in owning the ideas that they put down in that pre-writing process. So as we move through our course and all of our coursework at CSU Global, I really encourage everybody to think about this idea of iteration. So you'll go from global to local concerns. But when you're at the end and when you're revising for APA, remember, we can always iterate. We can always invite students to go back and say, where were you at the pre-writing stage? What did you know? What did you think? What did you value? And how has it changed? Iterating at the very end of the process where you were in the pre-writing strategies can be so helpful. It can really allow students to do a lot of things. It can allow them to say, oh, wow, if I didn't know that in the beginning, maybe a lot of my readers didn't. Maybe I'll use that in my conclusion. But it can do a larger piece, I think. It can really give young writers and developing writers the opportunity to see where the writing process has allowed them to grow. It can also give them the writing to grow their own agency by understanding that when they take the time to go through the steps of a writing process, they have tangible proof at the end where the product is. They can look back to the beginning of that process to the end and see that through their own devices and through the help of their teachers and their peers, they have grown in a significant way and created a document that evidences that growth and that can be measured in a way valued by the American education system. Thank you so much for listening to me. I hope these ideas on writing, process, and product spark more ideas. Really appreciate your time. And for more information or to become a part of the Clever Chicas project, cleverchicas.com. Be well.